Okay. All right. So we can also synchronize the controllers across plots. So what I'm going to do here is almost the same thing in terms of creating this new plot. So I'm going to create a new plotter, and but I'm going to give it the controller of the previous plot instead of having it create its own controller. So this instance is from up here. So this new plot, which I call plot sync, is going to have the same controller as the previous plot. And all I'm going to do here is the same thing, just plot some random data and have an animation function to update it. I'm just going to use a different color map here so it looks different. And then what you'll see is, so because these both now have the same controller, when I move one of these, the other one moves in sync. And it's bidirectional. So we can also use the IPyWidget's VBox or like vertical box in order to stack these two plots on top of each other. So these are, the same exact plots, but I'm just displaying them stacked on top of each other. You can also do line plots. So here I'm just creating a sine wave. And then I'm calling plot.line, giving it the data that represents a sine wave, giving it a line thickness to size, and giving it some color map so that the color is different as you go through the line. And you can also do 3D plots. So all I'm doing here is, so by default, the plot will think that it's a 2D camera. But if you give the argument of camera equals 3D, it's going to give you a 3D camera for dragging and zooming. And I'm just going to create some data to represent a spiral. And then I'm giving that to plot.line. So plot.line can take either 2D or 3D data. And then, the rest is pretty much the same. And then now what I have here is a spiral that I can, move around in 3D. So that's kind of an overview of how to use the simple plot interface in fastplotlib. And I'll talk more about this during the mesmerize-core demo. Does anyone have any questions? Otherwise, I'll go straight to the grid plot interface. Okay. It's going to shut down the kernel to not eat up the GPU. All right, so over here, instead of just importing the simple plot from fastplotlib, I'm going to import the image graphic class itself. And then I'm going to import the grid plot layout. So to create an instance of grid plot, you have to give it a shape. So this is like number of rows, number of columns. This is the simplest way to create a grid plot. And then I'm going to make an empty list. And I'm going to iterate through every subplot in the grid plot. And I'm going to create some random image data. I'm going to create an image graphic using that data. And I'm going to append that image graphic to our list of graphics. And then over here in my animation function, I'm going to iterate through every single image graphic in my list. I'm going to create some new random data, and I'm going to update that image graphic with the new data. I'm going to add this animation function to my grid plot animations. So when you do it like this, so as you can see, to grid plot, we have only given it a shape and no other arguments. So then it is going to create a grid plot where each of these are just independent plots, as in, the pan and zoom is independent for each of these. So in the next example, a few examples, I'll show you how you can synchronize them. Any questions so far? Okay, so this is a more complex way of creating a grid plot. So again, I'm going to just import image and grid plot. So over here, I'm also going to have a 2x3 plot. And you can manually define all of the cameras for each of the subplots in the grid. So this array is of the same shape as our grid plot, and I'm just going to have all of them be 2D cameras. So for image plots, you can only use the 2D camera. And then over here, I'm going to have some custom controllers. So that means that some of the subplots will be synced and some of them will not be. So this is like the most customizable way to set the controllers in a grid plot. So you give it an array of integers, and if it sees the same integer across subplots, it is going to synchronize them. So what this means is basically, the plot that is on the center top and on the bottom right, these two will be synced. And likewise, these two will be synced with each other. And this one will be independent. Okay, and then over here, I'm going to create the grid plot, and I'm going to give it the grid shape, the cameras, the 2D cameras we've defined, and the custom controllers that we have defined. And identical to the previous example, we're going to create a list of image graphics, and then iterate through every subplot in the grid plot to create some random data, create an image graphic with the random data, and add that to the subplot. And then, pretty much identical animation function to update the frame. So now what this looks like is, so this one has an independent pan and zoom. However, this one and the bottom right are going to be synchronized. And likewise, this one is going to be independent as well. And then these two in the bottom are going to be synchronized as well. Okay, move on to the next one unless there are questions. Okay, so you can plot more than just images with fastplotlib. You can plot histograms, line plots, and scatter plots as well. So this is an example of how you can plot like a line plot and like a ball, or like, a scatter plot with one item. So here I'm going to, again, import grid plot. And this time I'm going to import the line graphic and the scatter graphic. And actually, I think that these two are not required. I think I just didn't remove them from the previous versions of the examples. So over here, I'm going to create a 2x2 grid plot. And I'm going to have controllers where one is independent and these three are in sync. And then I'm going to create a grid plot, give it the shape. And so if you want all of your plots to have the same type of camera, you can also just give it, a single argument like this of like 3D or 2D. And then I'm going to give it the controllers that we've defined up there. So we're going to make some data that represents a spiral. And then what's going on down here is that we are plotting that spiral. And then this is just making the axes grids invisible. And then down here, this is just changing the camera perspectives in the X and Y to show you how you can look at different perspectives of the same data. And then over here, we are creating a marker that is going to move along the spiral in every rendering cycle. So that's what the animation function over here is doing, is that it is going to move the marker along the line in each rendering cycle. And then we're adding this move marker function to the animations. So it'll be clearer when I actually show you what it looks like. So we've got this line plot with a spiral, and there's this ball that's moving along the spiral. So from the controllers that we have defined, this top left plot is independent, and these three are different perspectives of the same data. So that is basically what is going on over here by flipping the X and Y axes. And the stuff that I had done here is actually to make the grids visible. Sorry. So that's what you're seeing here, like the grid on the bottom and also the XYZ axes. So as you can see, I can move through this, and the perspectives from each of these are different, even though it's the same data. All right, and lastly, I'll show you how you can do some scatter plots. So again, from fastplotlib, I'm going to import grid, plot, and scatter. And I'm going to, again, do a 2x2 shape. And you can combine 2D and 3D cameras within the same grid plot. So what I'm going to do here is that, these two views on the corners are going to be 2D, and these two other views are going to be 3D. And I'm going to synchronize, the 2D and 3D with each other. So you cannot synchronize the views between 2D and 3D views, because that doesn't really make sense. Yeah, so I'm giving it the shape, the cameras, and the controllers that we've defined above. And what I'm doing here is just creating, some random clouds, giving the clouds some colors. And then I'm creating a scatter graphic, giving it the cloud data, giving it the colors that I want, setting a color map, setting an alpha, which is just a transparency, and giving the dots a size. So I'm adding that scatter graphic to the subplot, and then making the grid and axes visible. And then over here, I'm again just showing how you can use the camera to flip the X and the Y. Oh, I did not run this. Okay. So we've got these 2D views on the corner, which are synchronized. As you can see, there are different perspectives of the same data. And likewise here, we've got these 3D views, which are synchronized, which are different perspectives of the same data. Okay, so that is basically it for the fastplotlib demos. I'll pause for a couple of minutes here to drink some water, and if people have any questions before going on to the mesmerize-core demo. So if you have questions, you can either speak in the video call, or you can put your questions in the Slack. Okay, so someone has a question. If you have a video of a set of frames, will it loop automatically or just stop? No, you can create like sliders. I'll show you how to do that in the Mesmerize core demo. But yeah, you just use IPy widgets and sliders, and then you define the frame. You can define the frame index by getting the value from the slider, and you just put that in your update animation function. Okay, so I will start with the mesmerize-core demo now. Clear all outputs. Clear all outputs. Okay, so the mesmerize-core repo is in the NetLab organization. I will link that in the Slack as well. And the demo notebook that I'll be going through is within the notebooks directory over here. Oh, and also for our repos, I mean, we would like it if people could start the repo. So that's you basically just click this up here, and that in the long term just helps us get funding so we can continue developing these tools. So the mesmerize-core repo has all the information on mesmerize-core, like where you can get the documentation, as well as the installation instructions, and yeah, and also the issue trackers over here if you will have issues or questions. And for smaller questions or discussion, you can also chat on Jitter. You can also use the Slack, but Jitter just keeps the history indefinitely, so it's useful in that way. Okay, so I'll start with the mesmerize-core demo. How did this get here? Okay, so I'm just going to import everything from mesmerize-core because we will be pretty much using everything. And that is kind of the intended way to import stuff from mesmerize-core. And I'm going to also import a few other things. I'll actually not be using matplotlib. All right. And then I will also import some things from fastplotlib for visualization. So the grid plot, image plot, the simple plot, and the slider to move through our frames, and the vertical box for layouts. All right, so the first thing to know about mesmerize-core is to set up your paths. So you always have to set a raw parent data path. And the purpose of this is to allow you to easily move data between computers and have everything still work with relative paths. So what that basically means is, like, let's say you have some directory structure that looks like this, like say /data / some username, and then some directory that contains like all of your experimental data. So what you would do is you would set like /data / your username as the parent raw data path. And then what happens is inside like the database that mesmerize-core creates, everything that is under this is stored only relative. So then you can move like, this experiment top level directory between computers, and you can set the parent data path within that computer as wherever you have moved it to in that new computer. So like, for example, what people do sometimes is like move data between powerful and less powerful computers, and this is kind of meant to facilitate that so that your files can be kept track of while you're doing that. So over here, I'm just going to set the parent raw data path as my Cayman data directory inside, my user accounts directory, because I'm just going to be using one of the Cayman example videos. And then I'm going to create a new batch. So that's basically a database that stores all of the Cayman output information, your parameters, and everything that you need. So you want to make sure that you don't accidentally delete this file or something like that. And all of the Cayman outputs will be organized within the same directory as where the batch file is located. So in this case, it would be localized within this directory. And then I'm just going to be using, the Sue demo movie for everything in this notebook. Okay, so I'm going to create a new batch. And it's important to note that if a batch file already exists, you cannot create a new batch file on top of it. If you want to use that batch file, you have to, use the load batch function, which I will show. And so basically what I'm saying is that create batch basically has a sort of write protection. It will not allow you to overwrite an existing batch because let's say you've had 100 experiments or so, you don't want to, accidentally run your notebook from top to bottom again and accidentally get rid of everything that you've analyzed in a batch. Okay, so I'll create a new batch. So this is an empty batch, and it's basically a data frame, or if data frame sounds hard to you, it's kind of like a spreadsheet or a database. And by default, it always has to have these columns. You should never modify the names of these default columns, but you can have as many additional columns as you want. Okay, so the way that you interface mesmerize-core with Cayman is by creating batch items. So the parameters that you use in mesmerize-core for these batch items are exactly the same as what you would use for Cayman. There's no difference in the naming or anything. These are passed directly to Cayman. The only important thing is your parameters dictionary has to have this key called main, and it's within this main key that you have the dictionary for parameters that you want to use with a given algorithm. Okay, so then I have those parameters, and then I'm going to create a batch item. And all that I define a batch item is a combination of the algorithm that I want to run, in this case, motion correction, which is just called mcore. You give it a name, and the name, is generally, just the same name as your input movie. And if you want to try out different parameter variants on the same input movie, you want to use the same item name for those different parameter variants. And I'll show you why that is useful later on. So like, for example, if you are trying, let's say, different stride values, you don't want to add in stride 24 in here. You want to keep it as the same name as your input movie name, for example, across your different parameter variants. Okay, and then we have the input movie path. So this is the path to the input movie, and this will pretty much accept anything that Cayman accepts because it passes things directly to Cayman. However, if it is not a TIFF file or not a mem map, it cannot be used for visualization. And if you have data formats that you do want to use with visualization, that is something that you can contribute. It's not very hard to do, so you can just get in contact with us by posting an issue on the repo, and I can guide you on how to do that. Okay, so I'm going to create a batch item for motion correction using the parameters that we have set, using that input movie, and I'm going to give this item a name called my movie. Okay, so this is what the data frame looks like now after adding this item. So, it's an mcore item with this name, with this input movie path. And as you can see, it only stores the relative path. And that's what allows you to move things between computers. The parameters, there's no output because this item has not been run yet. And this is a unique identifier that keeps track of all of the files associated with this batch item or with this row in the data frame. And you should never touch or modify the UID. So we can also create another batch item with, let's say, some different parameters. And one way you can do that is to just create a new dictionary with different parameters, and then call the Cayman.addItem extension on the data frame to do that. Okay, so we have this other item now, which has some different parameter values. So manually, defining different dictionaries of parameter variants can be quite tedious. So it's better to just, for example, use a for loop to try out different parameter variants. So one way you can do that is you have your initial dictionary of parameters, and then you make a deep copy of that. It's important to use deep copy. Dictionaries in Python get finicky if you don't deep copy them. So it's safe to just do a deep copy of the dictionary. And then we'll create a loop where we will try out these three different shifts parameters. And in each iteration of the loop, I'm going to create a new deep copy of the parameters dictionary. I'm going to modify max shifts, and I'm going to call the cayman.addItem extension on the data frame. And everything is the same, except this time it's going to be the new parameters that we have modified on the deep copy. So if you don't use deep copy, things get weird. Just deep copy. Okay, so now that I've done that, you can see how there are different max shift values in these three new batch items or rows that we have added. So when you want to try out a lot of different parameter variants and change, let's say more than one parameter, this can get, quite tedious to look at, and, not everything can be displayed. So that is why there's this extension called cayman.getParamsDiffs. And what that will do is you give it an algorithm and you give it an item name, and it will show you the parameters that are different across the same item name within the data frame. So that is why it is important, if you are using the same input movie, that you give it the same input name. So now if I run this, what it's going to show is that these are the three parameters which are unique across these batch items for the given item name and for the given algorithm. So this just clears up the clutter that is present in the entire data frame and shows you the unique parameters that are different. And the indices of these correspond directly to the indices in the parent data frame. Okay, so this is just how you add batch items or rows to the data frame. So if you actually want to run things, you have to call the cayman.run extension. So you can do that on single items by using iloc to index the item. So for example, the 0th item, if we want to run this item, you can call df.iloc0.cayman.run, and that is going to run that item. And all this is doing is running, the Cayman algorithm on that item, on that input movie with the given parameters in an external subprocess. And it's very important that you call process.wait afterwards. If you're running a single item, it doesn't really matter. But if you're using a for loop, like what I'll show you, that's when it's really important. So we can also use a for loop to run iterate through batch items. So over here, I'm just using iter_rows, which is just pandas. So, for each row in the data frame, if it's not the 0th item, so we're going to skip the first item because it's already been run up here. So what we're going to do is we're going to call row.cayman.run. And over here, it's very important that we call process.wait. If you don't do this, it's just going to keep going through this loop, and it's going to run every single item simultaneously, which could clog up the resources on whatever machine you're using. Okay, so that's going to run all of those items now. So this is how mesmerize-core makes it useful to perform your parameter search. You can create a loop to try out different parameter variants, and then you can just run all of these overnight on your entire data set and come back the next day and see which ones worked well. If anyone has any questions, this will take about a minute to finish.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great seminar. Thank you so much. I was wondering if in the future you guys will be thinking about, like if there is like a way that the if we potentially find an algorithm that can run through these different hyperparameters and then help us pick out the most optimal one. This is in case someone's like really new to calcium imaging and they're doing like Keeman or CNMFE for the first time. Is that something that you guys are thinking about, or is it going to be heuristics for a very long time?
So you're basically asking, is there like an automated way to figure out the
Yeah,
optimal parameter in the grid
yeah,
search?
yeah.
Well, I mean, what I still do is like after CNMF, I like look at the residuals and reconstruct a movie, which I'll talk about in order to evaluate which ones worked best. I think like the hardest thing with okay, well, like one thing with motion correction, what I've noticed is there are some evaluation metrics that Cayman has, like the crispness score. But I've found that it doesn't really work very well. Like sometimes it will tell you that the crispness score of like the pre-motion corrected movie is higher, even though you can clearly see that it has more motion than the motion corrected one. And as far as CNMF, the hardest thing, and this is something that I've talked to about with multiple people who've used Cayman for years, something I've thought about myself. It's just really hard to like think of like what's a good loss function to define an optimization problem to find the best parameters for CNMF. It's something that I think about once in a while, but it's not something that I've really dug into seriously. But I mean, if someone has like an idea for a good loss function, I think that the mesmerize-core's parameter exploration interface is something that would work nicely. That could work in that would integrate well with some system um, to evaluate your loss function and do gradient descent or something to find the best variant. But yeah, that's basically what I have to say for that.
Yeah, no, I understand because right now we're also like loading it and then we're going back and forth on which parameter is the best, and then it takes a few days because you'll have to check it on like different recordings as well. So yeah, that's why I just was wondering like what would you do?
Yeah, well, Caitlin is going to give a demo on a visualization system that kind of helps make that easier.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. All right, so yeah, so these motion correction items have finished running. So after batch items have finished running, you should call the load batch function on the batch path. And then what we can see is we can see that the outputs column in the data frame has been populated. So those items have been run. And we can see, like, for example, if an item has run successfully, like this, and it has. Just to show you some of the internals of what happens in mesmerize-core, you can use functions like get output path to get the path to the output mem map that contains the motion corrected movie. And as you can see, this is a very long path, which is not very human readable. And that is on purpose. These paths are made to be machine readable with these unique identifiers that allow the database to keep track of everything. I'm showing you like what this looks like, just so you maybe understand a bit of how things work. But you are not meant to use these paths manually. You are meant to use the extensions like get output to get the motion corrected output mem map. You're not meant to look at any of these things directly. So like similarly, we can look at the input movie path, which is there. All right, so I'll show you how you can visualize the motion corrected output. So first, I'm just going to give an index of the data frame row that I want to look at the motion corrected output of. So this will just be the first item. And then I'm going to load the input movie using tfl.imread. So this is kind of where if you have other data formats, just get in touch with me. And we're working on trying to make this work more universally with other input formats. And then, so for loading the motion corrected output, you do not have to use any of the manual Cayman code to load the motion corrected memmap. You are supposed to just use the mcore.getOutput extension. So that's what I meant with you should not work with these memmap output paths manually. You just need to work with the extension functions in order to use the outputs of Cayman. So all of these extension functions, like for motion correction, for example, if you look in the API, you can see, for example, under motion correction, there's like get output path, get output, and get shifts. So, get output is a really simple function. So yeah, all of the extensions that I'm talking about are documented under the API over here. So like, for example, in common, so these are the ones I was talking about, like run. And then we also had like add item, where you add batch items. So like all of these things are documented, get params diffs. So if you want to look more into that, all of that is here. And the link to the documentation is on the repository's README. All right, so back to the visualization. So loading the input movie and loading the motion corrected output using mcore.getOutput. So this is just grid plot code for plotting these side by side in sync. So I'm going to create a grid plot with one row and two columns so we can look at these side by side. And so another way to use this controllers is if you just give sync to controllers, it's going to sync everything in the grid plot. So you don't need to like manually give in integers if you just want something simple like everything being synchronized. And I'm going to create an image graphic. So I'm going to initialize this image graphic using the first frame of the input movie. So that's going to be the graphic for our input movie. And then I'm going to create another image graphic. And I'm going to use the first frame of the motion corrected movie for that. And I'm going to call that mcore graphic. And then in the grid plot has subplots. So I'm going to add to the top, well, to the left subplot, I'm going to add a graphic, and that's going to be the input movie graphic. And to the right subplot, I'm going to add the mcore graphic. And then I'm going to use IPy widgets to create a slider. And this is just a slider that will allow us to slide through the frames. So it has, a min of 0 and a max, which is based on how many frames are in the input movie. And then in the update frame function, which is like our animation function for the grid plot, what it's going to do is it's going to update the data in each of these graphics based on the slider value. And then I'm going to add this animation function to my grid plot. And I'm going to use a VBox so that I can show the grid plot and the slider stacked on top of each other. So that's what it looks like. So we've got the raw movie on the left, motion corrected movie on the right. And this is the slider that I can use to scroll through it. And as I said, these are synchronized because we passed sync to controllers. and it may be hard to see depending on the video stream quality, but you can definitely see how the motion corrected movie has removed most of the motion from the raw movie. Okay, so once you're done looking at visualizations, unlike the grid plot or the plot, you can call canvas.close to close the canvas, and that helps free up the GPU RAM if you don't have a powerful GPU or something. All right, I'll pause for a minute if anyone has questions. All right, okay, so I'll move on to CNMF. So just like before, the parameters dictionary for CNMF, same structure. The parameters that are used are exactly the same as what you use in Cayman. It goes directly to the Cayman API. It's just important that it has to be inside this key called main. And the only other key that the CNMF params uses is the refit. So if you're not sure what refit is, I'll take a look at the Cayman demo notebook. So if refit is true, it basically performs a second iteration of CNMF after the first one, and that is sometimes useful to refine your components. Okay, so we have some parameters for CNMF, and the way in which you add that as a batch item is you just call cayman.addItem. You give it the algorithm you want to use. In this case, it's CNMF instead of mcore. It's the same input movie. So I'm going to give it, the same item name. And then for input movie path, I want it to use the motion corrected movie. So the way in which you do that is you just call the mcore.getOutputPath extension. So this is going to get the path of the mcore or the motion corrected output movie. And what you're doing is you're telling, CNMF to use the mcore output as the input for CNMF. And then we give it the parameters dictionary that we created above. And I need to get water. I'll be back in a second. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so that's how you can create one variant of parameters. And just like before, you can also use loops or whatever other control flow you want in order to pull different parameter variants as batch items to the batch. So over here, I'm just using product from Itero Tools. And this is going to simplify trying out multiple different parameter variants for different parameters. Like, let's say you wanted to try out 5 different parameters. You would have a very large nested loop. So this just simplifies it. So what I'm doing here is I have gsig, k, and merge threshold. And what I'm doing is I'm just trying out like 2 different gsig values, 2 different k values, and two different merge threshold values. And then, just like before, I am using a deep copy of the CNMF parameters dictionary. And then in my loop, what I'm doing is if I use product and I call it on these three different things, it is going to basically create an iterator that will go through every single combination of these parameters. So then all I have to do is for gsig, k, merge threshold, it has to be in the same order as what you've passed here. We will, in each iteration of the loop, we'll create a deep copy of the CNMF parameters. This is very important to do, as I said before. And then, for gsig, k, and merge threshold, we will just set it with the parameters in each iteration. And then we just call again kmin.addItem, and then CNMF, my movie, and the input movie path, just like before, to get the motion corrected output, and then the new params CNMF, which is this instance or like this iteration of CNMF parameters. Okay, so did I not run? Oh, I did not run any of these cells. Okay, this, okay, single batch item, this. Okay, so now if I do this, we can see how there are a lot of CNMF items. So up here, this is just pandas indexing. It's kind of similar to NumPy. So I just want to display the CNMF items, and so it's not cluttered with motion correction items. And as you can see, there are a bunch of new CNMF items on this input movie with different parameter variants. So just like before, it is not easy to see the different parameter variants. So that's why we can call the kmin.getParams_diffs extension. So for the CNMF algorithm and for this item, I want to see all the different variants. And if I do that, this is much simpler to read. So we can see, as I said, these indices correspond directly to the parent data frame. So we can see for each batch item what are the unique parameters. All right, so just like before, we can use, df or data frame.iterRows in order to iterate through each of these rows and run kmin.run on these items. And so what this is going to do is this is going to start from the fifth item because that's where our CNMF stuff starts from, and it's going to run all of these. So this will take a few minutes, and I will pause for questions. Yes. So someone's asking like, are average max projections automatically computed? Yes. The answer is yes. And the way that you access those is, um, let me see. It's one of the extensions. Is it a motion correction? Caitlin, do you know where the get projection function is?
No, I've never heard of it.
You worked with it.
Oh, I thought you meant get like G. I was get. It's in the in core. It'll be in.
I think, wait, yeah, I thought we moved it to common, but I just wonder, is it just not documented? Pretty sure it's in common. Ah, it's not documented. We should document it. Okay, so the answer is you would call, like, for example, like df dot, well, like ilog0 for the first item, dot cayman dot get projection, and tell it which type you want. I'll show you how to do that real quick. All right, so these CNMF items have finished running. So just like after motion correction, you have to call load batch to reload the database, basically. And as you can see, the outputs are populated. And I'll just answer your question real quick. So the matplotlib is already imported. So you can do it like this. Get project. I think it's get projection. Let's say it's max. Yeah, you can do it like that. So it doesn't matter whether it's a motion correction item or a CNMF item. You just call cayman.getProjection. And you can either pass like max, std, or mean to get them. And for example, if I do a plot.imshow on this, yeah, you see that. Yeah, it's computed when the batch item runs. Because I mean they're used often, so we figured it would be convenient to just have them run so that you can just have it loaded and ready to go when you need to visualize. Yeah, so like regardless of whether it's a CNMF or Cayman item, you just CNMF or mcore item, you just call cayman.getProjection. So like in general, the way that we organized these extensions is that anything that pertains to CNMF is going to be under, the CNMF extensions, and anything that's unique to motion correction is going to be under that. But anything that is common to both is going to be just under the Cayman or common extensions. All right. So yeah, so these CNMF items have finished running. And I'm going to call, df.iloc. So this will look at the last item. So this is just to show you what the outputs dictionary looks like. So this is like the path to, like some of the projection images. So this is the path to the CNMF HDF5 file. It's the path to the CNMF mem map, and the path to the correlation image. I'm showing you this just so, you have an idea of how this works internally. But as you can see, these are just marked with the UIDs, which you should not modify. And you are not meant to manually work with these files. Like you never have to manually look at your HDF5 file. So there are extensions. So like in this case, if you do like df.iloc -1.cnf.get output, this is going to load it basically loads a CNMF HDF5 file as a CNMF object already ready to go. So if you do like, dot estimates, that's where you have, all of your things. Yeah. And so these CNMF extensions are documented under, so go to the homepage of the documentation, the API CNMF. These are all of the various CNMF extensions, and I'll be talking about most of them for the rest of this demo. All right, so we can see which batch items ran successfully. It should be all of them. Yep, they all ran successfully. And so I'll show you how you can do a simple visualization to look at the contours. So over here, I'm going to look at the CNMF item at this 5th index. And then on this item, if I call cayman.getInputMovie, it is going to get the input movie. So in this case, it's the motion corrected mem map that was used for CNMF. And then I'm going to use the CNMF.getContours extension. And I'm going to only load the good components here. And what this does is it loads both the contours and the centers of mass. So this function getContours is documented here under CNMF extensions. And we can click on it over here. And as you can see, like the first parameter it takes is component indices. And for example, it can be like a NumPy array of integers, so the actual integer indices, if you want to do it manually like that. Or you can just pass good or bad to get the good or bad components. And if you pass nothing, or if you pass all, it's going to give you all of the components. So over here, I'm going to get, the good components. I'm also going to get the bad components, so we can plot them like with different colors. And for this, I'm just going to create a simple plot, no grid plot for this. And then I'm going to create an image graphic and start it using the CNMF input movie, the first frame of that. And I'm just going to transpose it, which is basically over here is going to flip it 90 degrees. And sometimes you have to transpose, sometimes you don't have to transpose. You just have to try it. And the reason I'm transposing here is just so that it aligns with the contours. Sometimes it aligns with the contours without transposing. It depends on the shape of your input movie. Okay, and then for each of the contour coordinates in our list of contour coordinates, so this is the good components. So I've called the good components as cores and the bad components as cores bad. So for the good components, I'm going to plot them with this color. So you can define colors in fastplotlib by passing in an RGB array. So with this, you're giving values of 1 to both green and blue, and 0.7 as alpha to have some transparency. And this is going to result in a cyan color for the good components. So I do plot.line, give it the data of the coordinates, and then I give it z level 1 so that it plots on top of the image graphic. Otherwise, you would not be able to see it. And then we give it the colors, so the color that we have specified up here. And then for the bad components, I'm going to plot it in a different color, magenta, with red 1 and blue 1, and basically the same thing as before. And then we're going to make a frame slider, just like before, which starts at 0 with a max value of, depending on the shape of the movie. And then we have an update function, which basically just updates the image graphic according to the frame slider. Important to have the transpose here if you have it up here. And then just like again, we're going to use the VBlock to stack the plot and the slider. Okay, so that's what it looks like. So you've got the good components in cyan and the bad components in magenta. So I can use the frame slider to through these, pan and zoom, just like All right. I'll close this canvas. Okay, so we can also view the reconstructed movie, residuals, and reconstructed background. And doing this using the CNMF extensions in the mesmerize-core API makes this really simple. So we create a 2x2 grid plot, and we want everything to be in sync. And then I'm going to create an image graphic. So one of them will just have, the motion corrected movie that was used for CNMF with some color map. And then I'm going to get the first frame of the reconstructed movie. And the way that I do that is I call the cnmf.getRCM, or get reconstructed movie extension. And I want to make the reconstructed movie using only the good components. And I will start with just the first frame index. So the thing about the reconstructed movie is that if you wanted to create, okay, so first of all, CNMF outputs sparse matrices for like your spatial and temporal components, and like the total output of CNMF is usually only a couple hundred megabytes, but you can use those sparse matrices to create an entire reconstructed movie, which would, if you wanted to create the reconstructed movie using all frames, it would, it could be several hundred gigabytes, even if your movie is only, a few tens of gigabytes. So what this extension basically simplifies and allows you to do is compute the reconstructed movie on the fly as you are moving the frame slider. So it's only going to compute the reconstructed movie for the frame that is currently being displayed, and this works very fast, even with my large mesoscopic data set where each movie is 10 gigabytes and I look at like 4 of them at the same time. All right. Yeah, so that's how we make our reconstructed movie. And just like before, this function is also documented here under the CNMF extensions, if you want to look at all the arguments that it takes and everything. All right, so I will then create an image graphic using the first frame of the reconstructed movie. I'm going to transpose all of these, actually. So not just the CNMF movie, but everything, so that everything is synchronized. And I'm going to set a vmin and vmax to make some things easier to visualize. And then I'm going to get the residuals. So again, the residuals are also computed on the fly as you move through the frames. So we get the first frame of residuals, and then we create an image graphic just like before. And similarly for reconstructed background, we use cnmf.getRCB, get reconstructed background, and get the first frame of the reconstructed background, and create the image graphic for that. And then down here, for each of the subplots in the grid plot, all I'm doing is adding the corresponding graphic that I want. So for the top left, this is just going to be the motion corrected movie that was used for CNMF. This is the reconstructed movie. This is the residuals movie, and this is the reconstructed background. And then creating a slider just like before. And then over here in our update function, what we are doing is similar to before. So for left graphic, which is just the CNMF movie, we are just updating the frame index based on the slider value. But then for the reconstructed frame, we are calling cnmf.getRCM again on the good indices again. But this time we want to get the reconstructed movie for the current frame. And likewise for get residuals and get reconstructed background. All right, and the rest of this code is similar to before. Add it to the animations and then plot the grid plot and slider on top of each other. All right, so we've got motion corrected movie that was used for CNMF, reconstructed movie, residuals, and reconstructed background. So as I move through this frame by frame, it is computing reconstructed movie, residuals, and reconstructed background on the fly. So the reconstructed movie and residuals is something that I use quite frequently for evaluation to know whether CNMF was done properly. So in general, you ideally want your residuals to have no structure. You want it to look like random noise, because you want all of your structured data to be contained in your reconstructed movie and your reconstructed background. So this is something that's really useful for evaluating the performance of your CNMF with the given parameters. Right, any questions so far? All right, so I will close this canvas. And all right, so at the moment, I don't have any examples ready to show of how you can look at the temporal components. But as I've shown you previously, there is a line plotting graphic that is available in fastplotlib. However, I haven't done anything where you can show like multiple temporal components that are like stacked, and heat maps have not yet been incorporated into fastplotlib, but that is something that I want to do pretty soon. However, at the moment, you can use Seaborn to visualize your temporal components. And the way that you do that is you call the cnmf.getTemporal extension, and that basically gives you the temporal components from CNMF. So it is the C term in the estimates, if you're familiar with the CNMF model. Okay, so that is the temporal components. It probably looks very black to you guys. And you can also, run df over f and look at those things as well. And the API documentation shows you how to do that. So first, you have to run dtrend df over f, and these are the parameters that it takes. And these are exactly the same as what Cayman uses. It's passed directly to Cayman. And then after that, you use get dtrend df over f, and that gives you the detrended curves. And just like before, you can get the good ones, the bad ones, or customize it as you want. Can maybe show you actually how to do that. It could be useful. So if we do df.iloc.index, cnmf.run dtrend df over f, and I think I'll just run it with the default parameters for now. Okay, and then if I do get dtrend df over f, I should be able to see this after df over f. well, you can see that the y values have changed. Yeah, so that's how you can do df over f. Okay, and then component evaluation, which is also pretty useful. So up here, this is just a lot of GUI code, which I will not get into. If you're curious, you can ask me on Jitter or Slack later. And then what we're doing here is we are just getting the contours for all components. And then we're just getting the indices of good and bad components. And then we are setting a color that we will use for the good and bad components. And this is just a sanity check to make sure that the number of all components is the same as the sum of the number of good and bad components. And then down here, what I'm doing is this is just getting the parameters from the GUI, the initial parameters. And then over here, creating an image graphic to plot the movie. And then down here, for each of the coordinates in all of the coordinates, what it's going to do is if it is a good contour, it is going to give it a good color. And if it is bad, if it's classified as bad, it's going to give it a bad color. And it's going to append that to a list of contour graphics. And then up here in our animation function, this stuff is just like before to handle updating the frames in the image graphic. But then down here, what we're doing is we're getting the new evaluation parameters. And then we are running component evaluation again. So this runs on the fly, very fast. And then we're getting the new indices for the good and bad components. And then basically running this code to update the colors of the good and bad components. It'll be clear when I show you the GUI. Okay, so we have good components in cyan, bad components in magenta. So I can scroll through these frames. And as I will show you, I can change these on the fly, and it is going to run evaluation and change the components respectively. So this allows you to quickly run your component evaluation after CNMF. And if you are interested in knowing more about these parameters, I'd recommend taking a look at the Cayman documentation. It describes what each of these mean. Like, for example, the SNR is the signal to noise thresholds. The CNN thresholds have to do with a CNN that is used to classify whether something is a neuronal soma or not. It is something that you should not use if you are working with dendritic data. So if you're working with dendritic data, you don't want to use your CNN classifier. Okay, so after you're happy with your component evaluation, you can see that they are stored in the params dict in this new key called eval. So this is where they're stored. And then however, this is not saved to disk. And the reason for that is it would just be inefficient and very time consuming if you were saving things to disk as you were moving through these sliders. You would not be able to move these sliders as fast if it was saving to disk every time. So once you're happy with what you have, you can run the Cayman.save-to-disk extension, and it's basically going to save whatever changes you've made to your data frame to disk. And that is pretty much it for the mesmerize-core demo. Okay, I see one person has. I'll take questions now, either through voice or Slack, or I guess the Google chat. So one person's asking, if you want to save the reconstructed movie, is that possible? So, well, I have a couple of questions. One is, it's more efficient to compute it and visualize it on the fly. So I'm curious about why you want to store the entire reconstructed movie. But if you really want to do that, you can. So if you look at cnmf.getReconstructedMovie, you can see how it takes this argument called frame indices. So if we look at the documentation for getReconstructedMovie, get RCB, you can see that for frame indices, you can give it either like a single integer, which is how I did it, or if you give it none, it is going to give you the reconstructed movie using all frames, and that could be very, very large. But I'm also curious about why you want to compute the entire reconstructed movie. So it's going to return the reconstructed movie as a NumPy array, and then you can save it however you would like to save a NumPy array. Yeah, I mean, that's how you could do it, though I am curious about why you would want to do it like that. All right. Yeah, one of the reasons for like writing this was that visualization of it on the fly is just so much faster than creating the entire thing. It also uses up a lot of disk space, and then having to load the whole thing. Yeah. But yeah, there's quite a lot of functionality that the API provides, which I am not going through. Like for example, not entirely sure if this would make sense, but sometimes if you have extremely long imaging sessions, you will have some sort of bleaching. And the K-means, detrend df over f, it does detrending. So it does help you get rid of that bleaching that occurs if you're like imaging for like 3 hours or something. That's something that exists in my data sets. So sometimes looking at the reconstructed movie when you have bleaching can be a bit difficult. So you can actually give it custom temporal components. So like, for example, to the temporal components argument, you can actually pass it the output of get dtrend df over f, and it will make the reconstructed movie using the df over f as temporal components instead of the C estimates. So there's quite a bit of versatility that the API provides, which is, I think, just too detailed to go through in a simple demo. Okay, I'll pause for a few more minutes if people have more questions.
Is it sharing or not? Okay. Hi everyone. I'm just gonna run through like a quick demo of mesmerize-viz, which, as Kashal mentioned earlier, is kind of like an easy way that creates dashboards that allows you to look at some of the outputs from MCore or CNMF without having to like go through like repetitive plotting code over and over again in order to look at the outputs. So just a brief introduction, it's built off of fastplotlib, which is just a fast plotting library that Kashal has created. It kind of just streamlines the process of visually examining the results from MCore and CNF, especially with different parameters for a given input movie. So like Kashal was saying, you know, when you run MCore, you run CNMF, and you're trying to define what parameters work best for your movie. You're running MCore CNMF many, many times. And so the goal or hope for mesviz in the future, is a work in progress at the moment, is that you would be able to easily look visually at these outputs. You know, for example, for MCore, like what each motion corrected movie output looked like across, you know, for the same input movie, but with differing parameters. And so that you would easily be able to decide what parameters work best and to move forward with into CNMF. So basically it just kind of alleviates the process of writing plotting code for these visualizations over and over again, which can end up being really tedious. So kind of the design, this is just like a general photo. This is actually for a motion correction, but essentially what it will look like is you'll have all of the like batch items from your data frame here, and you're able to just select through each one, and the graphic will update for whatever you select. Additionally, you have access to look at the parameters that are associated with the input that you're looking at, as well as where some of the output paths are stored and the UUID associated with each batch item. So here just you see like a general grid plot, and in the grid plot it has like the raw movie, the motion corrected movie, the downsampled average movie, as well as some of those correlation and mean projection images. So this is just a general design of what mesviz will look like, as well as you have like a frame slider so that you can like scroll through a movie for outputs that makes sense for. CNMF will look largely the same, except for CNMF, you'll actually also have like tab options. There's like a lot more outputs for CNMF that you could visually be looking at, and having a like drop down menus, like you can select for each grid plot what you want to be viewing. And the end goal is to potentially have a multi-select option so that you could look at like select for each subplot in a grid plot what you want it to be looking at for an input item. So those are just some of the current capabilities. And then, like I was saying, future capabilities, you know, hopefully multi-select in order to compare visual outputs for a movie run with differing parameters. So essentially that could be, you know, for every single different combination of parameters you would have, say for CNMF, you would also have, like, that would be a batch item in your list. And if you could multi-select to say, okay, I want to look at the CNMF output, like the reconstructed movie, for, you know, these 6 different batch items that are each for the same input movie, but that I've run CNMF on with different parameters, like to look at the reconstructed movie and then again, like visually be able to pick what parameters work the best and move forward with those. Like I said, also like drop down selection to choose, like say just for a given movie, say you wanted to look at the residuals, the reconstructed background, as well as the input, to be able to like collectively look at everything. That's also an aim. Additionally, something else that we're looking to implement is to create a base class for individual subplot. So you would be able to create a subplot and then add it as an option to the drop-down list to have like a unique subplot. So those are just a general introduction and some future capabilities and kind of currently where mesviz is at, and hopefully future developments over the next coming weeks and months. But just a general demo of what it will look like. So I basically used the same example movie that Kashal was using in the mesmerize-core demo. And then all I've done is I have basically run motion correction and CNMF on this item with differing parameters, and then kind of manipulated the data frame in order to use mesmerize-viz to look at the motion correction and CNF outputs. So one current limitation of mesmerize-viz that should be changing soon is the fact that you can only look at motion corrected videos together and CNMF videos together. So I have the data frame filtered so that you see motion correction, and then here you also see CNMF, but essentially you are creating a viewer, and this is what the viewer looks like. So, these two motion corrected items, and you can select between the two, and you see how, things are updated, and you can expand to look at what your parameters were and some of the output paths here. And then you have the frame slider that goes across, and you can see what the entire movie looks like. So like I said before, this one on the left is the raw input movie, the motion corrected movie, and then the downsampled average of the motion corrected movie, as well as the mean projection and the correlation image. So a similar thing for CNMF, I've just filtered the data frame so that you see CNMF, and again, you get to look at your parameters that you used, as well as where the output paths are and the associated UUID for each item. And so here, same thing, slider to go through the movies. So here's actually the input as well as with the spatial contours on top. So identified neurons. And then also the background. So like Kashal was saying, this should look roughly like noise if you've done the process correctly, as well as some of the other outputs. But essentially, like I was saying with the tabs, so future, it's not completely implemented now, but you would basically have a drop down and be able to, using a GUI, select what you would want, and then it will appear here. So now you see two residuals. And so then you would have drop-down options to select different output items that you could potentially look at for CNMF. And essentially, if you had like I was saying, a unique subplot that you wanted to have shown, that could be in a drop-down as well for you to select from. But essentially, that is mesmerize-viz. It alleviates a lot of the plotting code and just puts it into a GUI, which is a nice, easier way to interact with looking at some of those outputs visually from after you run motion correction and CNMF on your movie. And that's pretty much it.
All right. Yeah, that's mostly it. I will maybe be here for just another 10 minutes or so. If people have questions, you can either just ask them verbally or put them in the chat. So one person has a question. How many different movies do you recommend loading at once for the max? Do you mean how many different visualizations for the same movie? Okay, different. How many different? Okay, that's mostly limited by that's going to be limited by your GPU and what your hardware can do. You can do insane amounts of grid plotting. There's one example. If you look on the fastplotlib README, there's an example of a 5x5, so 25 videos being updated at once. So yeah, it's mostly limited by your hardware, the number of things you want to show. But if you want to show, let's say you want to look at the motion corrected output of multiple different parameter variants at the same time, that's going to be limited by your hard drive. So I have no issue with loading 4 memmap files and scrolling through them with random access from a regular spinny hard drive. But I don't know, if you want to look at 10 things at once, you'd probably need an SSD or something. Yeah, that's typically what I do as well. Like, 4 to 6 is what I usually do. I mean, after you get some experience with using MCore and CNMF, you typically know the range of parameter variants that work, and you just want to narrow it down within that range. Yeah, that's great. Please do, report any installation issues and other bugs on GitHub, and yeah, can follow up on Jitto or Slack if you have more questions or ideas or discussion.